Pack your things, Julian. We're moving in a modern direction, and your legacy system as a luxury Sinclair Global can no longer afford. The voice belonged to Bradley Sinclair, the newly appointed vice president of operations. He was 28, wore a tailored Italian suit that cost more than my monthly mortgage, and possessed the unique brand of unearned confidence that only comes from being the CEO's nephew. He tossed a manila folder onto the mahogany conference table, his smirk widening as he looked at me. Your contract is terminated, effective at 5 o'clock today. Hand over your keycard, and we'll have security escort you out. I looked at the termination letter, then back at Bradley's smug face. I didn't shout, I didn't plead, I just felt a quiet, cold wave of clarity wash over me. Understood, I said. I signed the paperwork, picked up my briefcase, and walked out. Bradley had no idea that the legacy system he just discarded was the only thread keeping this $140 million logistics empire from imploding. To understand how a 28-year-old MBA graduate could make a mistake that would cost his family's company millions, you have to go back 12 years. I joined Sinclair Global Logistics in 2014. Back then, the company was a mid-sized regional freight forwarder operating out of a cramped office near the port of Savannah. The founder and CEO, Vance Sinclair, was a self-made logistics man who built the business on grit and handshakes. But grit doesn't scale. When I arrived, their dispatch system was a mess of shared Excel spreadsheets, whiteboard schedules, and manual emails. As the lead systems architect, my job was to build a digital backbone that could handle the chaotic reality of international shipping. International logistics isn't just about moving boxes from point A to point B. It is a highly regulated, high-stakes game of compliance and speed. Every container ship arriving from Rotterdam or Shanghai carries cargo that must be cleared by customs before it can touch American soil. If a ship sits at a berth waiting for paperwork, the port authorities charge demurrage fines by the hour. If a truck driver waits at a terminal gate for an e-manifest clearance, the logistics company pays for the idle time. For the first 5 years, I worked 80-hour weeks. I wrote the code, ran the fiber optic lines through the warehouses, and integrated our databases with the Customs and Border Protection system. By 2019, I had created a proprietary automated filing engine called TransitLink. It wasn't just a database. It was an intelligent API gateway that communicated directly with the federal government's automated commercial environment portal, known as the ACE portal. TransitLink was a masterpiece. When a container ship was 3 days out from the coast, our system automatically retrieved the vessel's stowage plan, verified the hazardous materials manifests, calculated the customs duties, and submitted the electronic entry filings. The API handled the secure cryptographic signing of every e-manifest, ensuring that 99% of our shipments cleared customs the exact second the ships docked at the port of Savannah. But I wasn't naive. I had seen too many developers write brilliant software for corporate employers only to be pushed out once the system was stable. In 2019, during a major corporate restructuring, I made a strategic decision. I approached Vance Sinclair with a proposal. I wanted to transfer the intellectual property rights of the TransitLink API to my newly registered private consulting firm, Mercer Software Consulting LLC. Vance was a smart businessman, but he was old school. He didn't care about software ownership. He only cared that the cargo kept moving. I offered him a deal. I would reduce my base salary by 40%, and in exchange, Sinclair Global would sign a software licensing agreement with my LLC. They would pay a licensing fee of $120,000 a year to use the TransitLink API. The contract was drafted by my personal attorney and contained a crucial clause in Section 14B. The software license was directly tied to my active employment. If Sinclair Global terminated my contract without cause, the license for the API would immediately expire within 24 hours unless a separate transition agreement was signed. For 7 years, this arrangement worked perfectly. Sinclair Global grew from a regional operator into a major international player, managing an annual revenue of $140 million. On any given day, TransitLink automatically processed the customs filings for 140 cargo ships and 450 container trucks. It was the silent, invisible engine that kept the entire supply chain running, Then came the summer of 2026. Vance Sinclair, now 56, and looking toward retirement, decided to bring his nephew, Bradley, into the business. Bradley arrived fresh out of an Ivy League business school, carrying a glossy presentation deck filled with corporate buzzwords like asset optimization, synergy, and overhead reduction. He was appointed as the vice president of operations, and his mandate was simple: cut costs, to prove he was ready to inherit the CEO seat. From the day Bradley walked into the Savannah headquarters, he looked at me like I was an expensive relic of the past. He didn't understand the intricacies of maritime customs. He didn't know what a customs bond was, or why the CBP required specific cryptographic keys to process hazardous cargo. All Bradley saw on the balance sheet was my salary, my title, and the $120,000 annual software licensing fee paid to Mercer Software Consulting LLC. To him, I was just an overpaid IT manager sitting on a cash cow. He wanted that money back. He wanted to replace my custom-built TransitLink API with a cheap, off-the-shelf logistics suite called Global Freight Pro, which promised a basic software package for a fraction of the cost. He figured he could cut my position, cancel the software license, and present a saving of over $200,000 to the board at the next quarterly meeting. That cost-cutting achievement would trigger a $200,000 personal bonus for him under the company's new executive incentive program. The tension between us reached a breaking point in late July. My mother was scheduled for a critical heart surgery in Atlanta, and I had requested 2 weeks of paid family leave. The leave had been pre-approved by the HR director months ago, but Bradley decided to use it as a weapon. He called me into his office, his boots propped up on his glass desk, and told me that my request was denied. "We are in the middle of a transition, Julian," Bradley said, tapping his pen against a copy of my leave request. "I can't have my lead systems architect slacking off for 2 weeks. In this new corporate culture, we need team players who are committed to the grind. If you can't prioritize Sinclair Global, then maybe you don't belong here." I stared at him, feeling the absolute coldness of his indifference. "My mother is having open-heart surgery, Bradley. This leave was approved in April. The system runs automatically. My team can handle the routine maintenance." "I don't care about what was approved in April," Bradley sneered, leaning forward. "I care about the current quarter. Your department is costing us too much, and your attitude is toxic. You're either at your desk next Monday, or we will find someone who is." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain the contract. I didn't tell him about Section 14B. I simply stood up, walked back to my office, and printed out my official transition logs. If Bradley wanted to play corporate hardball, he was about to learn that the logistics grid is governed by cold, hard code, not family connections. And my code belonged to me. The official termination meeting took place on a rainy Friday afternoon, just 3 days before my scheduled leave was set to begin. Bradley had called a meeting in the main executive boardroom on the 4th floor. I walked in, carrying only my notepad. When I entered, I was surprised to see the company's external legal counsel, Lawrence Miller, and the head of human resources, Sarah Jenkins, already seated at the table. Bradley was sitting at the head of the table, turning a high-end fountain pen between his fingers. He looked at me with an expression that attempted to look solemn, but ended up looking like a smug smirk. "Sit down, Julian," Bradley said, gesturing to the empty leather chair opposite him. I sat down and placed my notepad on the table. "I thought this meeting was about the API gateway upgrades for the autumn shipping rush. Things have changed," Bradley said, leaning back in his chair. "Over the past few weeks, we've been conducting a thorough audit of all department budgets. Specifically, we've been evaluating our technological overhead. As you know, the logistics industry is changing rapidly, and we need to remain agile. We've decided to streamline our operation." "By streamline, you mean cut my department," I said flatly. "By streamline, we mean we are migrating our entire digital tracking and customs compliance infrastructure to Global Freight Pro," Bradley corrected, a cold note of satisfaction in his voice. "We've done a cost-benefit analysis. Global Freight Pro offers a unified cloud-based solution for a fixed licensing fee of $30,000 a year. That is a fraction of what we are currently paying for your legacy system and your custom license." Global Freight Pro is a generic retail management package, I replied, keeping my voice level and calm. It does not have an integrated customs API that connects directly to the CBP ACE system. It requires manual input for hazardous materials manifests, and it doesn't support our automated cryptographic signature key protocol for foreign vessels. If you switch to that system, your port clearance times will go from 2 seconds to 3 or 4 days per ship. Bradley let out a short, patronizing laugh. That's exactly what I'd expect an old-school IT manager to say to protect his job. The sales representatives at Global Freight Pro assured us that their system is fully compliant and capable of handling all modern customs requirements. We live in a world of plug-and-play software, Julian. We don't need a single employee holding our IT infrastructure hostage with custom code. It's not about holding anyone hostage, I said. It's about operational reality. The TransitLink API is a custom-engineered pipeline. I've spent 7 years optimizing it for our specific trade routes out of Rotterdam, Shanghai, and Santos. Global Freight Pro has no custom routing logic. If you pull the plug, you're going to shut down the entire supply chain. Bradley's face hardened, the smirk disappearing as he leaned forward, slamming his palm lightly on the table. I am the Vice President of Operations, Julian. I make the operational decisions around here. Your resistance to these changes only proves that you're not aligned with the company's future. More importantly, we've decided that your refusal to cancel your upcoming leave, despite direct orders, constitutes insubordination. We need leaders who show up when the company needs them, not people who run away to deal with personal matters. My mother is undergoing triple bypass surgery on Monday morning, I said, my voice dropping an octave, cold and steady. I am not leaving her alone in an operating room because you don't understand how customs compliance works. Then you've made your choice, Bradley said, sliding the manila folder across the polished wood. This is your formal termination notice. We are terminating your employment contract for cause, effective at 5 o'clock today. Because it's a termination for cause, there will be no severance package. We've also drafted a formal notice to cancel our licensing agreement for the TransitLink software. Under the standard corporate transition guidelines, you have 24 hours to hand over all system documentation and admin credentials. I opened the folder and read the document. It was a standard corporate separation form, but Bradley had attached an addendum accusing me of insubordination and negligence for refusing to support the software transition. I looked at Lawrence Miller, the company's legal counsel. He looked down at the table, refusing to make eye contact. He knew what was in my 2019 contract, but he was on the corporate payroll and wasn't about to argue with the CEO's nephew in the boardroom. And what about the software transition? I asked, looking back at Bradley. We don't need your software, Bradley said dismissively. Our IT team has already installed the Global Freight Pro agents on the main servers. We've scheduled the system cutover for Sunday night at midnight. By Monday morning, we'll be running on a clean, modern platform without your overpriced API. You can pack your desk now. Sarah here will accompany you to ensure you only take your personal belongings. I looked at the signature line on the termination document. I took my pen, signed it, and pushed it back across the table. Are you sure you don't want to reconsider the transition period? I asked. Normally, a system migration of this scale requires at least 90 days of parallel testing. We need to verify the CBP gateway tokens. We don't need 90 days, and we don't need your help, Bradley said, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. We've got this fully under control. Your services are no longer required at Sinclair Global. Understood, I said. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and walked out of the boardroom. Sarah Jenkins followed me down to the 3rd floor, standing awkwardly by my desk as I packed my coffee mug, a few family photos, and my personal notebooks into a cardboard box. My team members looked on in stunned silence. I didn't make a scene. I didn't throw a tantrum. I simply shook hands with my lead developer, Lawrence, and whispered, "Take care of yourself, buddy. Don't sign anything you don't understand." At 4:45 p.m., I walked out of the Savannah headquarters. The humid Georgia air was thick with the scent of salt water from the nearby river. I put my cardboard box in the trunk of my car, got behind the wheel, and drove home. Bradley thought he had just saved the company $120,000 and secured his quarterly bonus. He had no idea he had just cut the brake lines on a runaway freight train, and the train was heading straight for a cliff. I sat in my home office on Friday evening, watching the rain beat against the window pane. The house was quiet. On my desk lay the original copy of the 2019 software licensing agreement between Sinclair Global Logistics and Mercer Software Consulting, LLC. I flipped to page 12 and ran my finger down to section 14B. The text was clear, drafted by my personal attorney, Vance Mercer, my cousin who specialized in intellectual property and corporate law in Atlanta. Section 14B stated, "The license granted herein for the use of the TransitLink API is contingent upon the continuous active employment of Julian Mercer by the licensee. In the event of termination of the licensor's employment for any reason, whether with or without cause, this license shall automatically terminate exactly 24 hours following the effective time of employment separation unless a separate, written software transition agreement is executed by both parties. Upon termination of the license, all access rights to the API gateway, cryptographic signing keys, and automated filing nodes shall cease immediately. The licensor reserves the right to revoke all API credentials without further notice." I checked my watch. The termination was effective at 5 p.m. on Friday. That meant the 24-hour grace period would expire at exactly 5 p.m. on Saturday. I opened my laptop and logged into the AWS console. The entire infrastructure of the TransitLink API was hosted on my private AWS account, under my company Mercer Software Consulting, LLC. Sinclair Global didn't own the servers, they didn't even have access to the AWS billing console. For 7 years, they had simply paid the annual license fee, which covered my hosting costs and left me with a comfortable margin. I looked at the API Gateway dashboard. The traffic logs showed a steady stream of requests. Even on a Friday night, the system was processing electronic data interchanges, EDI messages containing shipping manifests, customs entries, and port clearance codes. A container ship from Rotterdam was currently approaching the Georgia coast, and TransitLink was actively processing its cargo manifests. I did not delete any code. I did not deploy a virus. I did not format the servers. Doing so would be illegal under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and I had no intention of giving Sinclair Global any legal leverage against me. What I did was completely legal and within my rights as the sole owner of the intellectual property. First, I accessed the AWS Identity and Access Management console. I located the specific API access keys that allowed Sinclair Global's internal systems to authenticate with TransitLink. I set a scheduled task to deactivate those access keys at exactly 5 p.m. on Saturday. Next, I opened the cryptographic key store. The CBP ACE portal requires all electronic manifests to be signed with a unique, federally registered cryptographic key. This key was registered under my personal broker identification number and my LLC's corporate tax ID. Without this key, any data sent to the Federal Customs database would be rejected as unauthorized. I set a script to revoke the active signing certificate at the same time. Finally, I wrote an automated email. I addressed it to Vance Sinclair, the CEO, with copies to Bradley Sinclair and Lawrence Miller, the legal counsel. "Dear Vance, Bradley and Lawrence," the email read. This email serves as formal notice that pursuant to Section 14B of the 2019 Software Licensing Agreement between Sinclair Global Logistics and Mercer Software Consulting, LLC, the license to utilize the TransitLink API will terminate automatically at 5:20 p.m. EST on Saturday, August 7, 2026, exactly 24 hours after the termination of my employment. As of that time, all API access keys, cryptographic signing certificates, and database connections hosted under Mercer Software Consulting, LLC will be deactivated. Please ensure that your internal systems cease attempting to connect to our servers to prevent data corruption. Any unauthorized attempts to access our systems after the license termination will be treated as a breach of federal network security protocols. We are prepared to discuss a new licensing agreement or a structured transition plan upon receipt of a formal request from the board. I attached a scanned copy of the signed termination letter Bradley had handed me, along with a copy of the 2019 contract highlighting Section 14B. I clicked send, then I closed my laptop. I packed a small overnight bag, loaded my car, and began the 4-hour drive to Atlanta. My mother was scheduled for surgery at Emory University Hospital early Monday morning, and I needed to be there. I decided that once I checked into the hotel near the hospital, I would turn off my work phone. If Sinclair Global wanted to contact me, they would have to go through my attorney. As I drove through the dark, rain-slicked highway, I thought about the sheer scale of the disaster Bradley was about to unleash. He believed that software was just a utility like electricity or water. He thought you could just flip a switch and swap one provider for another. He didn't understand that the global supply chain is a delicate web of trust, legal certifications, and automated protocols. The Port of Savannah is the single largest single-terminal container facility in North America. It handles millions of tons of cargo every week. A single day of disruption can backlog the port for a week. When Monday morning arrived and the automated customs filings failed, the port authorities wouldn't care who Bradley's uncle was. They would simply block the cargo from leaving the terminal. The shipping lines would face massive fines, and the retail giants who relied on Sinclair Global for their inventory would watch their supply chains grind to a halt. By the time I reached my hotel in Atlanta at midnight, my phone was silent. I checked my personal email. There was no reply from Vance or Bradley. They were probably enjoying their weekend, confident that they had successfully trimmed the corporate fat. I plugged my phone into the charger, set it to Do Not Disturb, and fell asleep. The countdown had begun, and the clock was ticking down to 5 p.m. on Saturday. When the gate closed, there would be no way to open it without my key. Monday morning, August 9, 2026, began in the quiet, sterile corridors of Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. My mother was rolled into the operating room at 7:30 a.m. I sat in the waiting room with a cup of lukewarm coffee, my personal phone in my hand, and my work phone sitting in my briefcase, completely powered down. I had resolved that my family came first. The corporate storm brewing 4 hours away in Savannah was no longer my concern, but the storm had already made landfall. At 8:00 a.m., the first shift of logistics coordinators arrived at Sinclair Global's Savannah headquarters. Simultaneously, at the Port of Savannah, the gates of Terminal 4 opened for morning freight traffic. Under normal circumstances, the automated system would have already processed the customs entries for the vessels that docked over the weekend. The e-manifests for hundreds of shipping containers would have been digitally signed and cleared by the CBP ACE portal, allowing the yard cranes to load containers onto the awaiting trucks. Instead, when the first truck driver reached the terminal gate and scanned his paperwork, the gate barrier remained down. The gate monitor flashed a bright red error message: CBP ACE reject, cryptographic handshake failure, invalid signing authority. Within minutes, the same error flashed across the monitors of every terminal gate in the port. The automated customs filing system had completely stopped communicating with the federal database. The Global Freight Pro software that Bradley's team had installed at midnight on Sunday was trying to send data, but it lacked the CBP-approved SSL certificates and the cryptographic signature keys that were registered under my LLC. The federal customs server viewed the incoming data from Sinclair Global as an unauthenticated cyber threat and immediately blocked all access. By 9:00 a.m., the Port of Savannah was in absolute chaos. 140 cargo ships lay idle in the harbor or at the berths, unable to discharge their cargo because their customs clearances were suspended. 450 container trucks, stranded at the terminal gates, began backing up onto the local highways. The line of semi-trucks stretched for 12 miles along Interstate 95, paralyzing morning commuter traffic and drawing the attention of state troopers. Inside Sinclair Global's headquarters, the phones were ringing off the hook. Retail giants like Costco, Target, and Walmart were calling every 30 seconds. Their logistics managers were screaming. Their shipments of seasonal retail inventory were stuck on the docks, and under their strict carrier agreements, Sinclair Global was liable for a flat penalty of $250,000 per day for delivery delays. Furthermore, the Port Authority was already calculating demurrage fines. For every hour a cargo ship sat at the berth without discharging, the company was fined $15,000 per ship. With dozens of vessels delayed, the financial damages were accumulating at a terrifying rate of over $100,000 every 30 minutes. Bradley Sinclair was in his office, his face pale and his expensive Italian suit soaked in sweat. He was surrounded by his newly hired IT consultants from Global Freight Pro, who were frantically typing commands into a terminal trying to bypass the encryption errors. "Why isn't it working?" Bradley screamed, slamming his fist on the desk. "You told me this software was plug and play. Just bypass the cryptographic key and upload the manifests manually." "We can't, Mr. Sinclair," the lead consultant stammered, his fingers trembling over the keyboard. "The customs portal will only accept files signed by a registered agent certificate. That certificate is tied to Julian Mercer's personal broker credentials and his LLC. We don't have the private key. If we try to upload unsigned manifests, the CBP will fine us $50,000 per infraction and could suspend our operating license permanently." Just then, the office door flew open. Vance Sinclair, the CEO, walked in. His face was purple with rage, holding a printout of the email I had sent on Friday night. "Bradley," Vance roared, his voice shaking the glass partitions. "What the hell is going on? I have the Port Authority Director on line 1 threatening to revoke our terminal access, and the VP of Supply Chain at Costco on line 2 telling me they are canceling our $50 million contract. What is this email from Julian? What licensing agreement did you cancel?" "Uncle Vance, it's just a temporary technical glitch," Bradley stammered, stepping back. "Julian is just trying to sabotage us because I fired him for insubordination. We're migrating to a new system that will save us $90,000 a year. We don't need his software." "Glitch?" Vance bellowed, throwing the paper onto the desk. "We are losing $3 million a day. I just checked the automated dashboard, and every single one of our shipments is blocked by customs. Did you terminate Julian Mercer without checking his contract?" "He was insubordinate," Bradley pleaded. "He refused to cancel his family leave, and he was charging us $120,000 a year for a simple API. I did a cost-benefit analysis." "You're an idiot," Vance screamed. "His API was the only reason we had a green channel at the port." "Lawrence," Vance turned to the company's legal counsel, who was standing quietly in the doorway. "Is Julian's email correct? Does he own the cryptographic keys?" Lawrence Miller nodded slowly, looking miserable. "Yes, Vance. Under the 2019 agreement, the software license is owned by Julian's LLC and is directly tied to his active employment. When Bradley terminated his employment for cause on Friday, the software license automatically expired 24 hours later. Technically, we have no legal right to use his API, and because we don't own the cryptographic keys, we cannot sign the customs manifests." Bradley bypassed the legal review before issuing the termination. Vance turned back to Bradley, his eyes blazing. "Call Julian, now. Put him on speaker. Fix this or you are fired before the sun goes down." Bradley grabbed his phone and dialed my number. He got my voicemail. He dialed again and again, his hands shaking. Nothing. He sent 3 urgent text messages, promising to double my salary if I turned the system back on. I didn't answer. I was sitting in the hospital waiting room, watching the status board. The surgeon had just walked out to tell me that my mother's surgery was a complete success and she was resting in the recovery unit. I let out a long breath of relief, feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. At 11:30 a.m., I finally turned on my personal phone. Within seconds, it began vibrating continuously. I had 47 missed calls, 12 voicemails, and dozens of text messages. The most recent text was from Vance Sinclair himself. "Julian, please call me immediately. We have a catastrophic operational failure. We need to talk. I will personally resolve the leave issue." I smiled, deleted the messages, and called my cousin, Vance Mercer, the attorney. "Hey, Vance," I said. "The trap is sprung. They're panicking. I want you to handle the negotiation. Don't answer their calls for another 2 hours. Let them sweat through the afternoon shipping window. The demurrage fines should double by 3 p.m. Copy that." "Julian," my cousin laughed. "I'll make sure they understand exactly what the price of insubordination is." By Thursday morning, August 12, 2026, Sinclair Global Logistics was on the verge of bankruptcy. For 4 days, The company's entire shipping network had been frozen. The port authorities had refused to let their vessels discharge, and the line of semi-trucks had become a national news story. The math was brutal. 4 days of port demurrage fines for 140 ships had accumulated to $8,400,000. In addition, the retail giants had enforced their contract breach penalties, costing the company $12,400,000. The total damages stood at $20,800,000, and the company was facing multiple lawsuits that would destroy their brand. At 10 a.m., my cousin and attorney, Vance Mercer, and I walked into the glass-walled boardroom at the Savannah headquarters. We were met by the entire board of directors, including an exhausted-looking Vance Sinclair and several major institutional investors. Bradley Sinclair sat in the corner, his head in his hands, his eyes bloodshot. He was no longer wearing his expensive Italian suit jacket. His shirt was wrinkled and his tie was loose. Vance Sinclair stood up immediately, offering his hand. "Julian, thank you for coming, and thank you for agreeing to meet with us." I shook his hand and took a seat at the center of the table. Vance Mercer sat next to me, opening his leather portfolio and laying out the revised contract documents. "Let's get straight to the point," Vance Sinclair said, leaning forward. "We need the Transit Link API back online today. The port is threatening to seize our cargo to cover the demurrage fees, and our clients are ready to walk." "Understand misunderstanding regarding your employment and the software license." "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Vance," I said, my voice calm and measured. "Your vice president of operations terminated my contract for cause, accused me of insubordination for taking approved leave to care for my sick mother, and canceled the software license to claim a cost-cutting bonus. He explicitly stated that my software was an overpriced relic and that he didn't want my help." "Bradley made a catastrophic error," Vance Sinclair said, casting a furious glance at his nephew. "The board has voted to strip him of all operational authority. We want you back, Julian. We want to reinstate your original 2019 contract, pay you for your 2 weeks of leave, and give you a $50,000 signing bonus." Vance Mercer smiled, sliding a document across the table. "I'm afraid the 2019 contract is no longer on the table, Vance. The damages my client has suffered, both professionally and personally, require a completely new agreement. Here are our terms for the reinstatement of the Transit Link API license." Vance Sinclair picked up the document, his eyes scanning the pages. As he read, his face pale, he slowly sat back in his chair. The other board members leaned in to read over his shoulder. $450,000 a year? One of the board members gasped. "That's nearly 4 times the original licensing fee. The market value of an API that prevents $20 million in weekly damages is easily worth that much," Vance Mercer replied smoothly. "In addition, my client requires a 5-year guaranteed term. This contract cannot be terminated by the licensee for any reason without a $3 million buyout penalty." "And what about Julian's position?" Vance Sinclair asked. "I will return as the Chief Logistics Technology Officer," I said, looking Vance Sinclair in the eye. "I will have absolute, unilateral authority over all IT infrastructure, software systems, and technology vendors. No executive, including any member of the Sinclair family, will have the power to override my technical decisions." "And Bradley?" Vance Sinclair asked quietly. "Bradley must be terminated immediately for gross negligence," I said. "He must sign a confession of liability, and the company must pursue legal action against him to recover a portion of the losses he caused through his unauthorized actions. I also require a formal written apology from him, delivered to me and my entire team." A heavy silence fell over the boardroom. Bradley stood up, his face twisted in anger. "Uncle Vance, you can't agree to this. He's blackmailing us. We can find another way to bypass the keys." "Shut up, Bradley," Vance Sinclair snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "You've cost this company $20 million in 4 days because you wanted to play big shot. You didn't even read the contract. You're finished here." Vance Sinclair turned back to the board of directors. They whispered among themselves for less than a minute. The lead investor, a representative from a major private equity firm, looked at me and nodded. "We approve the terms. We cannot afford another day of shutdown. Sign the contract, Vance." Vance Sinclair took his pen and signed the new software licensing agreement. He then signed my new employment contract as Chief Logistics Technology Officer. He pushed the documents back to Vance Mercer. "Now, Julian," Vance Sinclair said, his voice pleading, "can you turn the system back on?" I opened my laptop, connected to the secure VPN, and accessed my AWS dashboard. With a few clicks, I reactivated the API gateway, re-enabled the authentication keys, and uploaded the active cryptographic signing certificates to the federal CBP ACE portal. "The system is active," I said, closing my laptop. "The queue should begin clearing immediately." Within seconds, the monitors in the boardroom, which displayed the port queue status, began to flicker. The red error alerts vanished, replaced by green checkmarks. The electronic manifests for the 140 cargo ships were digitally signed and approved by customs in a matter of minutes. Outside at the port gates, the barriers began to lift, and the 12-mile line of semi-trucks finally started to roll forward. Vance Sinclair let out a long sigh, his shoulders slumping in relief. Bradley was escorted out of the building by 2 security guards, carrying his personal belongings in a plastic bag. A week later, the company filed a formal lawsuit against him for breach of fiduciary duty and gross negligence, ensuring he would never work in corporate logistics again. I stood up, shook hands with the board members, and walked out of the room. My cousin Vance packed his briefcase, giving me a quiet thumbs up. I didn't go back to my desk. I walked to my car, drove back to Atlanta, and spent the next 2 weeks in the hospital and at home helping my mother recover from her surgery. My phone remained on, but it only rang with updates from Lawrence Miller, my lead developer, who was now my assistant. The system was running perfectly, the cargo was moving, and every container that cleared customs was a reminder to the board of who really held the keys to the kingdom.